Non-self and no-self. Many statements by the Buddha in the Sutta Nipata describe arahants, those who have realized the goal of the holy life, as being without atta and nirata. Arahants have neither a self nor an absence of self. The Maha-Nidesa defines the word atta as a belief in self, atta ditti, or a belief in an enduring eternal self, i.e. an eternalist view. It defines nirata as an adherence to an annihilationist view. Another description of atta is something grasped, and another definition for nirata is something to be relinquished. Therefore, an arahant does not believe in a self or in an absence of self, an annihilation of self. An arahant neither clings to anything nor needs to get rid of anything. The Maha-Nidesa explains further that whoever clings must have something to relinquish, and whoever has something to relinquish must be clinging. An arahant has transcended both clinging and relinquishing. These explanations by the Buddha and the commentators elucidate the meaning of anatta. Generally, people firmly believe in a self. At a coarse level, they view the body as the self. But upon deeper inspection, perceiving that the body cannot be the self, since physical change is so obvious, they identify with the mind or mental qualities. For example, feelings, memory, intelligence, and awareness. Indeed, they cling to one of the five aggregates as self, or to a unity of body and mind. That is, to all the five aggregates. Some people are more subtle, reckoning that the body and mind cannot be the self, but that a distinct self, a real, substantial, governing self or soul, abides within or beyond the mind and body. Some philosophers and religious leaders include a concept of self in their pursuit of the ultimate reality. Some profess to have attained or realized this truth, the Supreme Being, called by various names. Example, Paramatman, Brahma, or God. Many of these philosophers and religious leaders are highly intelligent and skilled, referred to in the scriptures as excellent ascetics and Brahmins, or divine philosophers, and the conditions they describe are extremely profound. But as long as these conditions still possess a fixed identity, or still pertain to a self, they are not yet the supreme, ultimate truth, as they are still tainted by attachment. Ultimate truth does exist. Buddhadhamma is not a nihilistic doctrine. One cannot realize this truth, however, with knowledge obscured and distorted by false perceptions, and with a mind confined by grasping to them. The reason that many philosophers and religious seekers are unable to realize ultimate truth, although they clearly know that the self of the body-mind five aggregates formerly adhered to is not real, is because they still maintain two kinds of self-deception. These two deceptions, characteristic of unawakened beings, are 1. Self-identification. The cherishing of a residual self-image maintained since the body is clung to as self, however refined this image becomes, it maintains essentially the same or of the same lineage, and is a result of misunderstanding. When such philosophers and seekers encounter and identify with an aspect of reality, they fix this image or concept on that condition, distorting the truth. Whatever is known by them is therefore not the pure, unadulterated truth. 2. Clinging, Upadana. Ever since believing in a rudimentary idea of self, these people harbour a tendency towards attachment. Besides sustaining a misguided self-view, they relate to phenomena with attachment, which prevents them from realizing the true nature of things. In brief, these religious seekers and philosophers are not yet liberated. They are neither liberated from misconceptions nor from clinging. These two deceptions are in fact inseparable. Combining them, one can say that these individuals mistakenly take an idea of self, lingering from an original attachment, and overlay it onto reality or nature. As a consequence, they remain bound. Liberation is possible only when one stops investing things with a fixed identity. Phenomena then cease to exist as substantial entities, and one realizes the ultimate truth. Buddhadhamma teaches that the self is a supposition, a conventional reality. Ultimate truth is diametrically opposed to conventional truth. The self applies to conventions. When one transcends conventions, one attains the ultimate truth, which is free from self. Stated simply, the truth is not self. If there is still a self, it is not the truth. Freed from conventions, the self ceases. By letting go, the self vanishes. The prime factors for delusion are attachment and fixed notions of self. As the self does not truly exist except on a conventional level, it is simply a belief. The self is just an idea. It is not a true, unchanging entity. Atta in the above quotation from the Sutta Nipata can therefore be defined in two ways. Firstly as self or belief in self, and secondly as something grasped. In addition, the passage mentions the pair of Atta and Nirata, and explains that an Arahant has neither Atta nor Nirata. Nirata can also be defined in two ways. Firstly as clinging to no self, i.e. an annihilationist view, and secondly as something to be relinquished. When one abandons the misapprehension of conventions and no longer attaches to a self, the matter is finished. One has reached freedom and ease. To cling to a notion of no self is unnecessary. The abandonment of clinging is the end. Nothing else is seized. With nothing seized, there is nothing to be relinquished, as confirmed by the Buddha's words. That which is clung to does not exist. Where, then, is there something to relinquish? Natiyata kuto niratam va. Even the expression clinging to a self is strictly incorrect, since the self is only a conventional reality. The proper expression is clinging to an idea of self. Our task is to cease grasping the belief in or concept of self. The self does not need to be relinquished, because there is no self that can be possessed. How then can it be relinquished? To believe in a self is to form a concept and superimpose it on reality. The teaching enjoins us to abandon forming such a fixed image. If one fails to do this, then although one has let go of certain conditions, one will fasten a concept of or deposit of self onto something else, obscuring or distorting its true nature. Therefore, the necessary tasks are to eliminate the attachment to previous notions of self, to refrain from attaching to anything else as self, and to avoid clinging to no self, ni rata. Then only the truth remains, which is neither concerned with nor dependent on personal beliefs and attachments. Since the self is an idea and a conventional entity established for facilitating communication, if one fully comprehends the self and makes use of it without clinging, then it is not destructive. Likewise, if one formally attached to an image of self, the teachings insist on abandoning this attachment. Without attachment, the matter is finished. It is unnecessary to identify with anything else. It is unnecessary to seize anything as self or to seek a self elsewhere. Therefore, the Buddha taught to cease clinging only to the self that has already been attached to, which means to cease clinging to the five aggregates. Once the self is no longer attached to, the question of self ends. Thereafter, it is a matter of attaining the truth, which does exist. A self, however, has no bearing on truth. Therefore, truth is described as anatta, non-self. Those who have realized the truth are free from any belief in self. They no longer need to believe in self or no self. Knowing what is non-existent as non-existent, the matter is finished. Therefore, there is arrival at the truth, the unconditioned, for which a self no longer has any significance. One harmful consequence of clinging to a self or believing in an image of self is that one concludes that the self is the agent, with power to control events. When the notion of self becomes most subtle, a sovereign universal self is envisaged as the creator of all things. This creator is imagined as intervening within the causal process, despite such intervention being unnecessary. It is unnecessary because nature exists autonomously. Interrelated conditioned dynamics function independently, without requiring a creator. Therefore, rather than say that a creator or God must exist as a prerequisite for the genesis of all things, it should be granted that natural phenomena themselves are the primordial reality. Since natural phenomena are reciprocally created in line with causality, simply speaking, they create each other. One need not then be troubled with questions of the past as what existed before God, who created God, or from where does God come. It is neither necessary nor true to say that natural phenomena or causal dynamics require a creator God to exist. If a God were truly the creator, the result would be two overlapping systems, God and nature. The course of nature would need to wait for the creative act of God. Natural dynamics, subject to divine designs, would be unwieldy. However, since things must proceed in accord with interrelated causes and conditions within their own system, acts of God would interfere and obstruct the continual causal flow of phenomena. Moreover, as God's temperament can vacillate, things would be affected accordingly. At one moment God would have them be one way, and the next moment another. As a consequence, nature would have even less opportunity to follow causality, ending in great confusion and chaos. This is not, however, the way things actually are. Natural dynamics occur in conformity with their conditionality. Some people say that nature follows laws, and that God created or established these laws. In that case, the laws must be uncertain, liable to change at any time, and untrustworthy, because the ordainer of the laws would abide beyond the laws. Such a being could modify the laws as desired. These laws, however, have invariably remained constant. The existence of a creator of the laws is unnecessary and improbable. Because nature must proceed in a specific fashion, natural conditions accord with causes and are just so. Ta-ta. They are not and could not be otherwise. A wee ta-ta. The laws themselves are only descriptions which we form by observing specific natural occurrences. Furthermore, the absence of a creator God and the autonomy of causal dynamics also resolves another question. Ultimate reality, or the unconditioned, is absolute. It does not meddle as the creator of phenomena or interfere with conditioned processes. From this perspective, Nibbana cannot be God, no matter how much some people try to equate them, unless one is willing to redefine the meaning of God. Under ordinary circumstances, it is natural for people to believe in a self and in a creator of the world, because things ostensibly require an agent or creator to come into being. Seeing through this false belief to underlie causality is difficult. Therefore, in former times, people believed that gods were the sole causes behind lightning, winds, floods, and earthquakes. It is not strange then that religious seekers and philosophers have believed in a soul or a creator. Clever individuals have created more refined, all-embracing concepts, but essentially they have been struck at the same point. The Buddha's release from self-identification, despite the probability that he would get ensnared in more refined notions of self, his revelation that the world functions without a creator, and his discovery of the non-self and non-creative unconditioned, count as enormous advancements in human wisdom. This realization is the escape from the massive pitfall that has trapped human beings. Despite understanding the principles of interdependence and dukkha, the great philosophers before the Buddha were hampered by the belief in a self or soul. The principle of non-self is therefore extremely difficult to see. The Buddha tended to use the characteristics of impermanence and dukkha to signal and explain anatta. The commentators recognized the need to explain selflessness by way of impermanence and dukkha, and valued this major advance in wisdom as a revelation not found before or outside Buddhism, as is illustrated by the following passages. The Sama Sambuddha explained the characteristic of not self by way of impermanence, by way of dukkha, or by way of both. In this sutta, the Buddha explains the characteristic of not-self by way of impermanence thus. Because if someone were to say the eye, ear, etc. is self, this would be unsuitable, because the rise and decline of the eye is apparent. Seeing such rise and decline, that person would conclude, myself arises and deteriorates. For this reason, saying the eye is self is unsuitable. Thus the eye is not self. The perfectly enlightened Buddha explained the characteristic of non-self in this sutta by referring to dukkha thus. Bhikkhus, the body is not self. If this body were self, then it would not be subject to disease, i.e. oppression, dukkha. And it would be possible to have it of the body. May my body be this way, may my body not be that way. But because the body is not self, therefore the body is subject to disease, and it is not possible to have it of the body. May my body be this way, may my body not be that way. The perfectly enlightened Buddha explained the characteristic of non-self in the suttas by referring to both impermanence and dukkha. For example, bhikkhus, material form is impermanent. Whatever is impermanent is dukkha. Whatever is dukkha is non-self. Whatever is non-self should be seen with perfect wisdom, as it really is. Thus, this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. Why did the Buddha explain in this way? Because impermanence and dukkha are manifest, they are easily observed. Indeed, when a cup, bowl, or other object slips from the hand and shatters, people exclaim, "Oh, how fleeting!" Impermanence, therefore, described as apparent. When a boil or blister forms on the body, or a thorn pricks a person, he exclaims, "Oh, how painful!" Dukkha is thus described as apparent. Anatta, however, is not apparent. It is not conspicuous. It is difficult to comprehend, difficult to explain, and difficult to describe. Whether Tathagatas arise or not, the characteristics of impermanence and dukkha are apparent, but the characteristic of non-self remains hidden unless a Buddha arises. It is evident only during the time of a Buddha. Truly, the religious ascetics and wanderers with great psychic powers, like the teacher Sarabhanga, were able to describe impermanence and dukkha, but were unable to describe non-self. If Sarabhanga, for example, had been able to describe non-self to his gathered community, that assembly would have been able to realize path and fruit. Indeed, revealing the characteristic of selflessness is not within the capability of anyone other than the omniscient Buddhas. In this sense, the characteristic of non-self is not apparent.